October 14th, 1943. 8th Air Force Headquarters, High Wycombe, England. The teletype machines clattered through the night. 60 bombers lost. 600 men dead or missing. Black Thursday. The message from Colonel Curtis LeMay arrived at 21:47 hours. Without long-range fighter escort, daylight bombing campaign unsustainable. Request immediate suspension of deep penetration missions. General Henry Arnold set down the telegram and reached for the secure telephone line to Washington. The entire strategic bombing doctrine of the United States Army Air Forces hung in the balance. What none of them knew was that a single aircraft, already in production but not yet deployed in numbers, would transform the air war over Europe. Within 4 months, American fighters would be hunting German interceptors over Berlin itself. The Luftwaffe's carefully constructed defensive system would crumble under relentless pressure from an aircraft that combined British engineering genius with American mass production. The P-51 Mustang would not just escort bombers to the German capital. It would destroy the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force. The mathematics of strategic bombing had always been brutal. By October 1943, American bomber crews flying from England faced a statistical certainty of death or capture. 25 missions constituted a complete tour of duty. The average life expectancy of a B-17 crew was 15 missions. The Luftwaffe had established a defensive system of extraordinary sophistication. 3 defensive lines stretched from the French coast to Berlin. The first line, positioned along the Channel coast, consisted of single-engine fighters that would attack bomber formations as they crossed into occupied Europe. The second line, deeper into France and Belgium, featured twin-engine fighters armed with rockets and heavy cannon. The third line, protecting the German heartland, contained the elite units flying the latest Messerschmitt Bf 109G and Focke-Wulf FW 190A fighters. German radar stations tracked bomber formations from the moment they formed up over England. Controllers vectored fighters to intercept with remarkable precision. The defensive system functioned like a massive conveyor belt. Fighters would attack, expend their ammunition, land to refuel and rearm, then take off to attack again. A single bomber formation might face the same German pilots 2 or 3 times during a mission. General Adolf Galland, commanding the German fighter forces, had refined these tactics to deadly effectiveness. His pilots had learned to attack from head-on, exploiting the B-17's weakest defensive zone. They concentrated on squadron leaders, knowing that destroying the lead aircraft would disrupt the entire formation's bombing accuracy. The twin-engine fighters stood off beyond effective defensive fire range and lobbed rockets into the bomber formations, forcing them to break formation and become vulnerable to single-engine fighters. The North American P-51 Mustang represented an unlikely convergence of British desperation and American industrial capacity. In April 1940, the British Purchasing Commission had approached North American Aviation with a request to build Curtiss P-40 fighters under license. North American's president, James Dutch Kindleberger, made a counteroffer that would change aviation history. His company could design and build a superior fighter in the same time frame required to tool up for P-40 production. 102 days after contract signing, the prototype NA-73X took to the air. The aircraft incorporated revolutionary design features, including a laminar flow wing that reduced drag at high speeds. The initial versions, powered by Allison engines, showed promise but lacked high-altitude performance. The transformation came when Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronald Harker flew a Mustang 1 in April 1942. He immediately recognized that the airframe's potential was limited only by its power plant. Within days, Rolls-Royce began fitting a Mustang with their Merlin 61 engine, the same 2-stage supercharged power plant that had transformed the Spitfire's performance. The Merlin-powered Mustang could reach 441 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. Its internal fuel capacity of 269 gallons gave it a combat radius of 475 miles. With external drop tanks, that radius extended to 850 miles. Berlin lay 580 miles from the American bases in East Anglia. The Packard-built V1650-3 engine produced 1,490 horsepower at altitude, maintaining power where German fighters began to struggle. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Hitchcock, Jr., the assistant military attaché in London, became the Mustang's most passionate advocate. A 10-goal polo player and former Lafayette escadrille pilot, Hitchcock understood both the technical and tactical implications of the Mustang's capabilities. His reports to General Arnold emphasized a critical point. The Mustang could not only reach Berlin, it could fight when it got there and still return home. Major General Adolf Galland commanded Jagdgeschwader 26 when the first American bombers appeared over France in August 1942. A veteran of the Spanish Civil War, the Battle of Britain, and the Eastern Front, Galland had accumulated 94 aerial victories by the time he was promoted to General der Jagdflieger in November 1941. Galland understood the strategic implications of the American daylight bombing campaign better than most German leaders. The Americans were attempting something the Luftwaffe had failed to achieve over Britain: the systematic destruction of enemy war production through precision bombing. If successful, the campaign would cripple Germany's ability to wage war. The German fighter force defending the Reich consisted of approximately 800 single-engine and 150 twin-engine fighters in late 1943. These aircraft were manned by a diminishing pool of experienced pilots. The Eastern Front consumed pilots at an alarming rate. Training programs had been shortened from 2 years to 6 months to maintain pilot strength. New pilots arrived at operational units with 110 to 150 hours of flight time, compared to the 250 to 300 hours typical of American pilots. But the German defenders possessed critical advantages. They fought over their own territory, allowing damaged aircraft to land safely and pilots to return to combat quickly. They could concentrate forces against specific raids, achieving local numerical superiority despite overall inferior numbers. Most importantly, they only needed to fly far enough to reach the bomber stream, while American fighters had to fly all the way from England and back. The mission plan seemed brilliant in its complexity. 2 separate bomber forces would strike simultaneously at Schweinfurt's ball-bearing plants and Regensburg's Messerschmitt factory. The divided attack would split German fighter resources. The Regensburg force would continue to North Africa, avoiding the deadly return flight over German defences. 376 B-17 took off that morning. The Regensburg force departed on schedule at 0700 hours. Fog delayed the Schweinfurt force for 90 minutes, destroying the plan's careful timing. German fighters that had attacked the Regensburg force had time to land, refuel, rearm and attack the Schweinfurt force. Lieutenant Colonel Bernalay Jr., flying with the Regensburg force, later wrote, "Swarms of fighters queued up for their attacks. Our formations began to dissolve as B-17s fell burning or exploding. The sky was filled with parachutes, debris and tracer fire. 60 B-17s were lost, 600 men killed, wounded or captured. The Luftwaffe had demonstrated that unescorted daylight bombing was unsustainable. The Americans suspended deep penetration missions for 6 weeks while they searched for a solution. The suspension could not last. Political pressure demanded continued attacks on German war production. Intelligence indicated that ball-bearing production had recovered from the August raid. Another strike on Schweinfurt was ordered. 291 B-17s crossed the Dutch coast at 1300 hours. The escort fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts, turned back at Aachen, their fuel exhausted. The bombers flew on alone for another 200 miles to the target. The Luftwaffe response was overwhelming. Over 300 fighters attacked in coordinated waves. Major Wilhelm Moritz, leading Jagdgeschwader 3, employed new tactics. His fighters carried 210mm rockets, fired from beyond the range of defensive guns. Each rocket contained 90 pounds of explosives, enough to destroy a bomber with a single hit. First Lieutenant Robert McCallum, pilot of Paddlefoot, watched the attacks develop. They came from 12 o'clock high, 4 abreast, wings lit up with cannon fire. The rockets looked like aerial torpedoes trailing smoke. When they hit, the B-17 just disintegrated. The bombing results were excellent. Reconnaissance photos showed severe damage to the ball-bearing plants, but 60 bombers had been lost, with another 17 written off due to damage. 650 men were casualties. Among the survivors, morale collapsed. The daylight bombing offensive had reached its crisis point. The first P-51B Mustangs arrived at RAF Boxted in Essex on November 20th, 1943. The 354th Fighter Group, technically part of the 9th Air Force, was immediately placed under 8th Air Force operational control. The pilots had trained on P-39 Airacobras and P-47 Thunderbolts. Few had flown the Mustang before arriving in England. Major James Howard, commanding the 356th Fighter Squadron, conducted his first orientation flight on November 25th. The moment he advanced the throttle, he knew they had something special. At 30,000 feet, where the P-47 struggled, the Mustang still had power to spare. December 1st, 1943, marked the Mustang's combat debut, a fighter sweep over Belgium and France. 5 days later, on December 5th, the group flew its first bomber escort mission. The results were immediate. Bomber losses dropped dramatically whenever Mustangs provided escort. Lieutenant General James Doolittle assumed command of the 8th Air Force on January 6, 1944. The former racing pilot and aeronautical engineer brought a fighter pilot's perspective to the bomber-dominated 8th Air Force. His first visit was to 8th Fighter Command headquarters at Bushy Hall. Doolittle noticed a sign in the operations room. "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." "Who put that up?" Doolittle asked. "It was here when I arrived," replied Major General William Kepner, commanding 8th Fighter Command. "Take it down," Doolittle ordered. "Put up a new one. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters." This simple order transformed American fighter tactics. Previously, fighters had remained tied to the bomber formations, flying weaving patterns above them to maintain position. Doolittle freed them to hunt. Fighter groups would fly ahead of the bombers, catching German fighters as they formed up. They would pursue retreating Germans to their airfields, strafing them on the ground. Colonel Don Blakeslee, commanding the 4th Fighter Group, embraced the new tactics immediately. A former Eagle Squadron pilot who had flown Spitfires with the RAF, Blakeslee understood fighter combat. He instituted new formations, abandoning the rigid 3-plane elements for flexible 2-plane teams. He pushed his pilots to be aggressive, to seek combat rather than wait for it. Operation Argument, known to history as Big Week, represented the full implementation of the new strategy. For 6 days, the 8th Air Force from England and the 15th Air Force from Italy launched maximum efforts against German aircraft production. Over 3,000 bomber sorties dropped 10,000 tons of bombs on aircraft factories. But the real battle occurred in the air. P-51 Mustangs, now equipping 5 fighter groups, ranged deep into Germany. On February 20th, Major James Howard single-handedly defended a bomber formation against 30 German fighters for over 30 minutes, earning the Medal of Honor. His combat report was characteristically brief. Saw enemy aircraft attacking bombers. Engaged same. German losses during Big Week were catastrophic. The Luftwaffe lost 355 fighters in combat and another 150 on the ground. More critically, 17% of the German fighter pilot force was killed. These were the experienced veterans who could not be replaced. Training programs could produce new pilots, but not the expertise needed to survive in aerial combat. The psychological impact of American fighters reaching Berlin cannot be overstated. Berlin was the heart of the Reich, Hitler's capital, the symbol of German power. No single-engine Allied fighter had ever reached it before. Colonel Donald Blakeslee led 81 P-51Bs of the 4th Fighter Group on that historic mission. The weather was terrible. Cloud cover extended from 2,000 to 28,000 feet. Navigation was by dead reckoning and time. The bomber stream stretched for miles, over 800 heavy bombers protected by nearly 900 fighters. Captain Donald Gentile, flying Shangri-La, engaged German fighters near Hanover. We dropped our tanks and dove on about 30 109s and 190s forming up below us. They scattered immediately. I caught one 109 and gave him a 3-second burst. He rolled over and went straight down. The Luftwaffe response was fierce but disorganized. German controllers had not anticipated fighters over Berlin. Radio intercepts captured their confusion and disbelief. Many German pilots refused to believe the P-51s were American aircraft. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Oberhansley, leading the 358th Fighter Squadron, remembered reaching Berlin. The flak was incredible at bomber altitude. But we were above it, looking down on this massive aerial battlefield. And we were there, American fighters over the German capital. 2 days later, the 8th Air Force returned to Berlin in even greater strength. 660 B-17 and B-24s, escorted by 900 fighters, attacked targets in and around the German capital. Major General Adolf Galland personally led Jagdgeschwader 1 into combat. Flying his personal Focke-Wulf 190A8, Galland attempted to break through to the bomber formations, but was intercepted by escorting Mustangs. His wingman was shot down before they could reach firing range. The Luftwaffe lost 69 fighters destroyed and 26 damaged. American losses were 35 bombers and 11 fighters. The arithmetic was clear. The Luftwaffe could not sustain such losses while the Americans grew stronger each day. With 7 fighter groups equipped with P-51s by April 1944, 8th Fighter Command shifted to pure offensive operations. Fighters swept ahead of bomber formations, catching German fighters as they took off. They stayed behind after the bombers turned home, hunting Germans returning to their bases. Colonel Herbert Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, developed Zemke's Wolfpack tactics. His P-47 Thunderbolts would simulate a bomber formation's radio chatter, drawing German fighters into ambushes by P-51s flying high cover. On April 8, 1944, Lieutenant Robert Goebel shot down his 5th German fighter. We caught them taking off from Brandenburg. The inexperienced pilots would raise their gear and try to turn immediately. Their planes would stall and crash. The veterans would build speed first, but by then we were on them. In May 1944, the strategic bombing campaign shifted focus to Germany's oil production. The P-51D model had begun arriving in April, featuring 6.50 caliber machine guns instead of 4, a bubble canopy for better visibility, and improved performance. On May 12, 1944, 800 bombers attacked synthetic oil plants at Leuna, Bohlen and Zeitz, escorted by 800 fighters. The Luftwaffe launched everything available, over 500 fighters. The resulting air battle was the largest in history to that point. Major George Preddy, commanding the 487th Fighter Squadron, achieved multiple victories. They came up in massive formations. We'd dive through them shooting, zoom back up and dive again. It was controlled chaos, but we had the advantage. The Luftwaffe lost 126 fighters destroyed and 64 damaged. American losses were 46 bombers and 13 fighters. While German aircraft production actually increased in 1944, pilot quality had collapsed. New pilots arrived with minimal training and rarely survived their first missions. The ultimate test came on D-Day. Over 13,000 Allied aircraft supported the invasion. The Luftwaffe managed only 319 sorties over the invasion beaches. Allied fighters claimed 42 German aircraft destroyed for the loss of 35 Allied fighters. Lieutenant Colonel John Meyer flew 3 missions on D-Day. We owned the sky completely. We'd patrol over the beaches without seeing a single German aircraft, then fly inland, destroying German convoys trying to move in daylight. The Luftwaffe's absence over Normandy represented complete defeat. Fighter units had been pulled back to defend the Reich. Those remaining in France lacked fuel, spare parts, and experienced pilots. By July 1944, the Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The statistics told the story clearly. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe had approximately 2,395 single-engine fighters. By June, despite producing over 3,000 new fighters, operational strength had fallen to 1,523. Pilot losses were catastrophic. 2,262 fighter pilots lost in the first 5 months of 1944. American fighter claims for 1944 totaled 5,954 German aircraft destroyed in aerial combat and 4,131 destroyed on the ground. The P-51 Mustang accounted for 4,950 of these victories. Mustang losses totaled 2,520 aircraft, a victory-to-loss ratio of nearly 2-to-1. The transformation was remarkable. In October 1943, the 8th Air Force had nearly suspended operations due to unsustainable losses. By June 1944, American bombers could attack any target in Germany with acceptable casualties. The key difference was fighter escort, specifically the P-51 Mustang's ability to accompany bombers deep into enemy territory. The destruction of the Luftwaffe had consequences far beyond the bombing campaign. Without air cover, German ground forces in Normandy were subjected to devastating tactical air attacks. Allied fighter bombers destroyed tanks, trucks, trains, and artillery with impunity. The German army's mobility, its greatest tactical advantage, was eliminated. The Eastern Front suffered equally. Luftwaffe units transferred west were unavailable to support Wehrmacht operations against the Soviet Union. The Red Air Force achieved air superiority by mid-1944, contributing to the catastrophic German defeats of that summer. German war production, despite Albert Speer's organizational genius, could not overcome the effects of strategic bombing. Oil production fell from 196,000 tons in May 1944 to 30,000 tons in September. Aviation fuel production virtually ceased. Luftwaffe training flights were cancelled for lack of fuel. New aircraft sat idle on airfields. The psychological impact on German morale was profound. Cities deep within the Reich were subjected to daylight precision bombing. The Luftwaffe, once the symbol of German military might, could no longer protect German civilians. The technological lessons learned influenced military aviation for decades. The combination of high-altitude performance, long range, and heavy armament became the standard for fighter aircraft design. The importance of industrial capacity, training systems, and tactical innovation had been proven decisively. The P-51 Mustang represented more than technological advancement. It demonstrated the decisive importance of industrial capacity in modern warfare. North American aviation produced 15,000 Mustangs during the war, with peak production reaching 600 aircraft per month. German aircraft production, despite reaching record levels in 1944, could not match this output while simultaneously replacing losses on 3 fronts. The Mustang proved the value of international cooperation. British engineering, in the form of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, combined with American mass production to create the war's most effective fighter. The Packard Motor Company's ability to mass-produce the complex Merlin demonstrated American industrial adaptability. Training systems proved equally crucial. American pilots arrived in combat with 250 to 300 hours of flight time, trained safely in the United States with unlimited fuel and aircraft. German pilots, their training constantly interrupted by Allied bombing, reached operational units with 110 to 150 hours of experience. This qualitative difference proved as important as numerical superiority. The strategic bombing campaign's success depended entirely on fighter escort. Pre-war theories about self-defending bomber formations proved disastrously wrong. Bombers could destroy enemy war production, but only if fighters protected them from interception. Command philosophy mattered decisively. Doolittle's tactical revolution, releasing fighters from close escort duty, transformed the air war. By taking the offensive, American fighters forced the Luftwaffe to fight on American terms. German fighters could no longer choose when and where to engage. On April 25, 1945, the 8th Air Force flew its last combat mission of the European War. 370 B-17s, escorted by 550 P-51 Mustangs, attacked rail yards in Czechoslovakia. Not a single German fighter challenged them. The Luftwaffe had ceased to exist. General Adolf Galland, in post-war interrogation, admitted, "The American long-range fighter was the decisive factor. Without escort, daylight bombing would have failed. With it, we were helpless. We could not defend our airspace, our cities, or our armies." Hermann Göring's famous statement, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost," captured the psychological impact. But his detailed analysis proved more revealing. Your bombers might have eventually succeeded through attrition alone, but the long-range fighter changed everything. It destroyed my fighter force not through gradual losses, but through systematic annihilation. The legacy extended beyond World War II. The P-51 served in Korea, providing close air support when jets lacked range for extended operations. Foreign air forces flew Mustangs into the 1980s. Veterans of the air war gathered for reunions decades later, former enemies finding common ground in their survival of history's greatest air battle. Colonel Hubert Zemke reflected on the transformation. In 1943, we were losing badly. The bombers couldn't survive without prohibitive losses. Then came the Mustang. Within 6 months, everything changed. It wasn't just the aircraft, it was the entire system of training, tactics, leadership, and industrial support. But without the Mustang's capabilities, none of it would have mattered. The United States Air Force Museum displays a restored P-51D painted as Shimmy the Fourth, flown by Major George Preddy, the highest-scoring Mustang ace with 26.83 victories. Visitors often ask why this particular aircraft receives such prominence among jets and spacecraft. The answer lies in historical impact. The P-51 Mustang demonstrated that technological superiority, industrial capacity, and human courage could achieve the impossible. It proved air power could be decisive in modern warfare. Most importantly, it showed democratic nations could produce weapons and warriors capable of defeating tyranny when faced with existential threats. The transformation from Black Thursday to air supremacy took less than 6 months. In October 1943, American bombers faced annihilation. By April 1944, American fighters dominated German skies. The catalyst was a single aircraft type combining the best of British and American engineering. Today, historians debate strategic bombing's effectiveness and morality. But none dispute fighter escorts' decisive impact on the campaign's success. Without the P-51 Mustang, the combined bomber offensive would have failed. With it, Allied air power helped destroy Nazi Germany's ability to wage war. The arithmetic was profound. In 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 1 bomber for every ton of bombs dropped. By mid-1944, that ratio improved to 1 bomber for every 40 tons delivered. The difference was measured in thousands of lives saved. General Karl Spaatz, commanding United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, offered the final assessment. The P-51 was the weapon that won the air war over Europe. Everything else, bombers, crews, ground support, intelligence, would have been wasted without fighter escort to target. The Mustang gave us that capability. In the skies over Germany, young men in P-51 Mustangs defeated the Luftwaffe and secured Allied victory. Their achievement ensured D-Day's success, enabled the bombing campaign, and hastened the end of World War II in Europe. The Mustang had done more than provide fighter escort. It had changed the course of history. The concrete runways of former 8th Air Force bases now serve civilian purposes or have returned to farmland. The pilots who flew Mustangs are passing into history. But their achievement endures, proof that technology and courage can overcome impossible odds. At Duxford Air Museum, a restored P-51D regularly flies demonstrations. The Merlin engine's distinctive sound and the laminar flow wings' graceful lines remind visitors of when such aircraft represented aviation's pinnacle. Children watch in wonder while veterans remember when squadrons of Mustangs filled European skies. The guide explains specifications and combat records. But the P-51's true legacy transcends statistics. It lies in the transformation from defeat to victory, from desperate defense to overwhelming offensive power. America's P-51 Mustang overwhelmed the Luftwaffe through more than just technical superiority. It succeeded through the convergence of international cooperation, industrial might, tactical innovation, and human courage. Faced with catastrophic losses, the United States Army Air Forces adapted and triumphed. The Mustang was the instrument, but victory belonged to the system that produced it, one that could recognize problems, develop solutions, and implement changes under the pressure of total war. As the last veterans pass, their legacy remains. Technological superiority, properly employed, can achieve decisive victory. The P-51 Mustang's ability to reach Berlin didn't just save the daylight bombing offensive. It validated American military doctrine and established air supremacy as essential for modern operations. The Luftwaffe, which had terrorized Europe from 1939 to 1943, was reduced to impotence by a single aircraft type. The same nation that pioneered strategic bombing at Guernica now cowered under Allied attacks, unable to protect its cities or armies. The numbers tell part of the story. Nearly 5,000 German aircraft destroyed, hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs delivered, combat effectiveness that exceeded all predictions. But the true impact lay in what was prevented: the collapse of the bombing offensive, war prolongation, and countless Allied deaths. When Colonel Don Blakeslee led his Mustangs over Berlin on March 4, 1944, he demonstrated that American power could reach the heart of enemy territory. The sight of American fighters over the Nazi capital sent an unmistakable message throughout occupied Europe. Liberation was coming. The technological achievement was remarkable. In less than 4 years, North American aviation designed, tested, refined, and mass-produced an aircraft exceeding the performance of fighters developed over twice as long. The Merlin engine integration, accomplished in months rather than years, demonstrated wartime urgency driving innovation. The fuselage fuel tank addition, extending range to Berlin despite stability concerns, showed pragmatic problem-solving under pressure. But technology alone didn't defeat the Luftwaffe. Young men, average age 22, mastered complex aircraft, learned sophisticated tactics, and engaged in combat at altitudes where temperatures reached -50 degrees. They flew in formations of hundreds, maintaining position while scanning for enemies, monitoring instruments, and managing fuel. A moment's inattention meant death. The German pilots they faced were equally brave, defending their homeland against overwhelming odds. By 1944, many flew their third or fourth aircraft type, each with different characteristics. They faced Americans by day, British by night, Soviets in the east. They operated from airfields under constant attack with declining fuel and spare parts. The human cost was staggering. The 8th Air Force lost 26,000 killed, with 28,000 becoming prisoners. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 40,000 pilots, mostly in the war's final 18 months. Each loss represented personal tragedy, families destroyed, potential unrealized. Yet from tragedy emerged transformation. The P-51's success proved air superiority essential for modern military operations. Ground forces couldn't operate under enemy air attack. Naval forces required air cover. Strategic bombing needed fighter escort. These lessons, learned over Germany, shaped military doctrine for generations. The end came swiftly. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe remained formidable. By June, it was broken. By September, it existed largely on paper. The speed of collapse testified to American strategy's effectiveness and the P-51's decisive impact. 8 decades later, certain lessons remain clear. Technological superiority can overcome geographic disadvantage. The P-51's range negated Germany's strategic depth. Industrial capacity matters in prolonged conflict. America's ability to produce thousands of Mustangs while building bombers, training pilots, and supplying allies proved decisive. Tactical innovation multiplies technological advantage. Doolittle's offensive fighter employment transformed the P-51 from defensive to offensive weapon. Most importantly, the P-51's success demonstrated democratic nations' ability to mobilize effectively for total war. The aircraft was designed by a company that had never built fighters, powered by a foreign engine, flown by citizen soldiers who were civilians 3 years earlier. This achievement testifies to democratic society's strength when facing existential threats. The P-51 Mustang's legacy extends beyond military achievements. It represents American innovation, industrial capability, and determination. It symbolizes the Anglo-American alliance that proved decisive. Most fundamentally, it embodies young men's courage who flew into hostile skies and prevailed through skill, determination, and technological advantage. As military aviation enters the age of unmanned systems, the P-51's lessons remain relevant. Technology provides capability, but human judgment determines application. Industrial capacity enables military power, but strategic vision directs it. International cooperation multiplies national strength. The story of America's P-51 Mustang defeating the Luftwaffe is ultimately about transformation through innovation. Faced with strategic failure, the United States adapted and triumphed. The Mustang was the instrument, but victory belonged to the system, one recognizing problems, developing solutions, and implementing changes under total war's pressure. The P-51 Mustang ended the Luftwaffe's European reign, enabled Normandy's invasion, and shortened World War II significantly. In doing so, it saved countless lives and demonstrated that technological superiority, combined with courage and industrial might, could overcome any challenge. This lesson, learned over Germany, remains as relevant today as when American fighters first appeared over Berlin, forever changing history's course.